Let me take you back to 2017. On the international stage, it was the year that Britain officially exited the European Union after the Brexit vote of 2016, and the first year of Donald Trump's first term as US President, which included his withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement that had been signed only 2 years prior. In Australia, Malcolm Turnbull was still Prime Minister. For now. So much has happened in the years since. A pandemic, a worsening planetary crisis, and intensifying geopolitical conflicts. I find it hard to imagine or sometimes recognise a world before 2020. But 2017 was also a key year in the development of a global movement to recognise the rights of nature. A movement that had been simmering for decades. In 2017 alone, New Zealand was a world leader in granting the Wanganui River legal status as a living entity, acknowledging the deep connection of Wanganui iwi Māori in the process. The High Court of Uttarakhand in India recognised the Ganga and Yamuna rivers as legal persons with certain rights, while elsewhere in the same country, the Narmada River was declared a living entity, alongside a ban on sand mining. In the US, the Colorado River took the state of Colorado to court, seeking recognition of its legal rights. And here, in Melbourne, Australia, the Yarra River Protection Act, Willip-Gin Birrarung Moron 2017 was passed, acknowledging Birrarung as one integrated and living natural entity. What was in the water in 2017? Hey humans, my name is Tim McIntosh Hanna, and welcome back to More Than Human and our series Living with Birrarung. In our first episode, we began with a question. What does it mean for a river to be alive? In our second episode, we explored how this was acknowledged in the case of Birrarung, how settler colonial and traditional owner law interact, and who was and continues to be involved in that process. In this episode, we're going to zoom out to examine the broader global context. How and why did institutions and states begin acting on recognition and rights of nature? And where does Birrarung fit into this wider picture? To help answer these questions, we're joined by three legal experts. You've already met Dr. Erin O'Donnell from the Melbourne Law School in episode 1 and 2. Joining her is Elke Nicholson.
My name's Elke Nicholson and I work at Environmental Justice Australia, which is a kind of niche community legal centre that works exclusively on public interest environment matters. So we usually represent community environmental orgs or First Nations clients to protect a country or look after the environment in some way.
And Dr. Michelle Maloney from Australian Earth Laws Alliance.
The work we do inside AILA, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, is first and foremost interested in earth-centred governance. How do we shift all of our systems, political, legal, economic and education, everything, to be focused on earth-centeredness, focused on caring for country first, and then fitting institutional and legal reform around that idea. So I think it is helpful to think about the broader context and the history of where rights of nature and legal personhood for nature has emerged from. And one way to tell the story is chronological, because in terms of the pushing back at Western law, the story is very much a story for the 21st century.
So this episode will be a kind of journey through this legal movement for and of our times. Like the river itself, the telling of the story twists and turns before we arrive back at Birrarung and recenter ourselves in our story for the series. Welcome back to the More Than Human world. This is Living with Birrarung, episode 3, Something in the Water. I'm going to start with the familiar voice of Dr. Erin O'Donnell. This is the third episode Erin has featured in, so I do quickly want to shout out how generous she was with her time and answers when we spoke. Erin is recognised internationally for her research into the legal rights of rivers. She's a member of the Birrarung Council, an associate professor and ARC research fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School, has worked with the World Bank on water markets and security, and has worked extensively with traditional owners across Australia. It's hard to find someone more qualified to talk about the legal rights of rivers. Before we dive into the more contemporary manifestation of these legal rights, I think it's important to highlight something we've already mentioned in this series, that the idea of a living river, or a river as a rights holder of equal or greater importance to us humans, is not a new concept. It is known and has been known for a long, long time by Indigenous peoples. However, as we zoom out to the global context in this episode, we can shift the lens on that statement slightly.
So the global context is a fascinating one. There is a transnational movement now to recognise both rights of nature generally, but also rights of rivers specifically. In terms of where it began, in some ways it began tens of thousands of years ago. So for Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, not just in settler state colonies like Australia, but Indigenous peoples everywhere. So Irish people, Scottish people, French people, people from all over the world have been building relationships with rivers and embodying those in law. So one of the PhDs that I examined just recently looked at that from the position of Sri Lanka and Buddhist connections, as well as local Sri Lankan community, Indigenous people's connections to rivers there. This idea that rivers are alive is a global one. It's expressed often in different ways, but at its core, you find it everywhere. Everywhere that people have been living in relation with rivers, it finds its way into their laws and their ways of caring for those rivers. So it's a global movement. It's of incredibly long standing.
In Australia and other settler colonial societies, the push to acknowledge rivers as alive and deserving of rights is rightly led by traditional owners and Indigenous communities. But as Aaron has pointed out, there is a universality to this idea. It may manifest in different ways, which we will introduce throughout this episode, but at its core, wherever humans are living alongside rivers, their relationships with those rivers are being expressed through their laws and practices. Now, I'm aware that there is a risk that framing rights of nature in that way, as something that has broad appeal and agreement, ignores some very clear challenges to actually achieving legal recognition or the desired outcomes. So to guide us in this exploration, let's get some definitions straight. What are rights of nature? I asked Elka Nicholson this question and got a great answer that brings together both the acknowledgement of a deep time understanding from Indigenous peoples and an explanation of how this interacts with our contemporary Western legal systems.
It's a really great question. What are the rights of nature? Particularly because it's often posed as a really novel idea. And there's a couple of ways in which that's not a good portrayal of it. But there is some new territory that's being explored. So if you think about lots of First Nations communities around the world, they have often had a really deep sense of interconnectedness with nature, and that is part of the culture, the traditional law, how they make decisions as a society. So it's in that way sort of integrating the rights or the needs of nature into human decision making has been here for a really long time. So that's not a new concept at all, right? But then we've got our Western legal system, which is trying to give effect to some of those ways of thinking. And that's the new territory. So interestingly, the Western legal system actually has mechanisms for giving non-human entities legal rights. So the most familiar one for most of us is a corporation. So this is a thing that does not exist in the world. It has no tangible existence whatsoever, but we've found a way to give it existence in the legal world. It has rights to own property, it can be spoken for, it can go to court to defend its rights, it has all these sort of mechanisms around it to give it an existence. And there's lots of other examples like trusts or even nation states. They're kind of a fiction that we have made into something in the legal world. And in a similar way, we have the role of guardians who can speak for someone who can't speak for their rights. So it might be a child or an old person. And so that concept of having someone speak for someone else's rights in our legal system, like these things are also not that new or novel. So the novelty comes when we try and get the Western legal system to use those vehicles to give effect to that huge, holistic, interconnected concept that's existed in First Nations cultures for a really long time. And that's the tricky area, because it's not an easy match, right? It doesn't fit naturally. And that's where there's a lot of exploring and experimenting going on.
So yes, the idea of a river or natural entity having legal rights is old, but the application of that to the Western legal system, not so much. In fact, the concerted push to recognize rights of nature in Western legal systems is only a few decades old. The seminal paper on this appeared in 1972, written by US legal academic Christopher D. Stone. It was titled, "Should Trees Have Standing? Law, Morality, and the Environment." There are two ideas from this paper I found particularly interesting. First, the choice to extend rights to the rightsless has always been made by those with rights. Emancipation was decided by those who were free. The right to vote was extended to women by those who could already vote. So we should acknowledge that at the core of many of these conversations is an inherent power imbalance. Second, Stone leans on one of the core interests of the Western legal system in his argument, the protection of property rights. He argues that if nature were to have rights or property interest, damaging that property should come at a cost to the damager. This is a reversal of the business as usual understanding of the relationship between property and nature, where nature usually is the property. This is Michelle Maloney from Australian Earth Laws Alliance.
So when you put the lens of law over your eyes in Australia today, and you look out at the world through Western law, nature is not alive, except for the Yarra. But we're talking about the Western legal system in Australia. Nature's not alive, it has no rights. They're just a collection of objects that we can either protect like a national park or eat like a cow.
Making a case for the rights of nature to centre around property also preferences Western worldviews, which tend to specifically elevate property rights. As we saw in episode 2, we should also be elevating and respecting the worldviews and approaches to law of those who have long-standing relationships with place, namely traditional owners. A caveat, I'm not a legal scholar, and I know there is a lot more in Should Trees Have Standing that could be unpacked. However, for the purposes of our story in this episode, it was a starting point that then took several decades to find its purchase. I asked Elke how and why these ideas began to gain more traction in recent decades.
The impetus for rights of nature, or to give those rights, is because we have seen, obviously in the last couple of hundred years, vast degradation of our natural systems, and there have been environmental laws introduced over the decades to really mixed effect. So some of them simply aren't effective enough at looking after our environment. And I think the rights of nature movement arose from needing to profoundly shift how we look at nature, how we give it a voice that has meaning in our system so that it actually gets the protection it needs, not just sort of a tick box exercise in approvals and so on, but actually changes the way that we look after the environment.
In other words, there is often a gap between what the law should do and what it actually achieves. Andrew Kelly said this in our second episode when he mentioned the difference between passing legislation and actually enacting it. Affording natural entities rights, or a voice, is one way to hold decision makers and other actors to account for their actions in relation to those entities. In fact, that is where some of the first attempts to truly challenge the Western legal system to practically consider the rights of nature emerged from.
So in 2006, Thomas Lindsay and Mari Margul in the US of A, then working with the CELDF, Community Environmental Legal Defence Fund, were working with a range of community groups. And those groups were trying to stop unwanted developments in their local communities.
What Michelle is referring to here is the beginning of one of the first attempts to embed rights of nature in US law.
And what they found was the repeat patterns of working for an environmental-oriented law firm, where the lawyers were helping them think about what was happening, lodge submissions to try to ask the government to stop unwanted developments like dumping sewage sludge on agricultural lands, extracting water from their natural streams so that Nestle could sell them. But what they found over and over again was that the giant corporations who were invading their place would pay attention to what the communities were arguing about, modify their documents, resubmit them, and the government would always approve them. So the communities felt like they were always losing, and even when they won a case, they'd lose the next stage. So Thomas and Mari decided that they were tired of working that way and they wanted to step outside the legal constructs of Western law, which are designed in a very top-down fashion where either a federal government or a state, provincial government can overrule local communities. And they helped these communities start simply making their own laws, where they declared that within their local community, nature had rights, nature had the right to exist, flourish, thrive, survive, and they had a right to care for and defend and protect the living world.
You can see here a reflection of the earlier point about power imbalances from should trees have standing. Communities and the more than human world are often on a lower rung and several steps behind larger, well-resourced actors whose damaging behaviours are legally protected and enabled. They are also often where action starts, including, as we saw in episode 2, when we looked at the push for a Yarra River Protection Act in Victoria. For Thomas and Mari, this humble beginning in 2006 defending the interests of local communities in the US caught international attention.
Now, their strategy was really unique at the time. Other people were not doing this. They were basically declaring the rights of nature within a jurisdiction and then waiting to see what happened. Some of those were absolutely not challenged and they just stayed in place, and the communities celebrated the fact that they were able to declare the rights of nature. But where that didn't happen, Thomas and Mari were of the belief that even when a big company came to litigate against them to try to stop them from, forbid this local community from stopping them from coming, it actually opened up an important conversation where the power is and how nature had no rights in law. So from their very early work, they were actually invited by a group of folks in Ecuador, and they were part of this chain of ideas flowing through the planet, where in 2008, the Ecuadorian Constitution, the first constitution in the world to recognise the rights of nature, was heavily influenced by the work that Thomas and Mari and others were doing on rights of nature.
Now, looking at this from 2026, the US isn't exactly leading the charge on environmental issues. And Erin pointed out that they haven't been spectacularly successful in recognising rights of nature, despite the pioneering work of Thomas and Mari. However, there have been several other significant inflection points in the 2 decades since. Here's Erin again.
2008 was a really big banner year because that was when Ecuador passed its constitutional reform to recognise rights of nature in Ecuador and gave every Ecuadorian citizen the ability to go to court to defend those rights. And that really put rights of nature on the global map as a serious environmental legal mechanism. Having said that, it still stayed on the fringes until 2017. And in 2017, we had Wanganui River, we had the Gunda and Yamuna rivers. There was a court case from 2016 that actually came out in 2017 from Colombia recognising the rights of the Rio Trato, and we had Birrarung. And so, again, very different articulations of the rights of the river and the nature of the river in settler law as a living person or a legal person. But that year, 2017, was an enormous inflection point. Since then, it has not been possible to talk about rights of nature as a fringe environmental law. There are now over 400 examples from around the world, and nearly 100 of those relate to rivers.
Now, not every example of rights of nature emerged from the same place, by which I mean, while momentum built across several parts of the globe at around the same time, many of these inflection points represented the culmination of local, sometimes decades-long processes led by communities or Indigenous groups. There is an incredible diversity of approaches. Each represents an experiment as governments and communities try to find ways to articulate and then enact rights of nature in their local context.
So the contrast we see around the world is partly around how the different laws have come about. So for some places, like Ecuador, they've had massive constitutional reform. So they've brought in a whole lot of really progressive new things in a constitution, like the highest document in the whole country. And that's how they've brought in rights of nature laws. In other countries, we've seen enormous landmark decisions in courts. So somewhere like Bangladesh, they had a decision a couple of years ago that gave all rivers in the whole country living entity status. And the court actually set out this extraordinary sort of sweeping list of things that the government must do to implement that decision. So it ranged from education in schools through to developments and pollution and all kinds of things. It was huge, right? So that was possible partly because Bangladesh already had a concept in their legal system and their culture of the commons, like the common good. So fresh air and clean water and land that's not contaminated was already a concept. And it was partly because of that the court could make this really far-reaching decision.
As we can kind of see emerging here, local context also led to differently scaled approaches. Some were national, some were hyperlocal. Michelle paints a picture of this as a large tree, with different branches emerging as time progressed, moving from general towards specific. And as this tree grew, it also came closer to home.
What first happened was this one big branch was recognizing or stating that nature had rights across a whole jurisdiction, like this local community or like all of Ecuador. And that trundled along for a while. And whenever I would, in the early days, talk about rights of nature, people would point to South America and say, well, that's just a South American thing. But in the meantime, Bolivia passed a law in 2010 which recognized the rights of Mother Earth as a national law across their jurisdiction, but they didn't activate that very thoroughly. But then, as many people know, what happened in 2017 in New Zealand, suddenly this different branch of law appeared on the rights of nature tree. So instead of saying rights of nature exists across all of New Zealand, under their unique particular circumstances, the New Zealand government recognised that the Whanganui River had the same rights as the legal personhood rights. And so suddenly that was an ecosystem-based approach. And what's really interesting from someone in Australia's perspective is people could no longer just, dismiss rights of nature or any of these other ideas as something strange from South America. It became quite the growth area. But we know that in New Zealand's case, it did not come from the same place that the Ecuadorian constitution did. It didn't come from a declaration of the rights of nature. It came out from the Maori people's ongoing, many decades long argument that it was their land. So under the Treaty of Waitangi, it was under their compensation agreement that this arrangement was created. The government didn't want to give up control to the Maori people, and the Maori people wouldn't sign off on the compensation agreement unless they got their river back. So a bright spark decided to make the river own itself so that they could go forward with the agreement. And I was recently on a judging panel for the World Futures Council, and we decided that the New Zealand legal personhood movement had to be recognised as one of the greatest sort of influences and inspirations to other activities around the world, because ever since then, we've had places in India, Bangladesh, Colombia, other entities like mountains and lagoons and other things being seen as so important to those local communities, they want to somehow give it greater protection.
This is a great example of how there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this. Every jurisdiction, by definition, has its own legal systems, and its own challenges in reconciling those with diverse localised values. The case of the Whanganui River demonstrates how local Indigenous struggles for justice and protection can align with and catalyse global movements. After the break, we'll be back to look at the challenges, uncertainties, and opportunities of different approaches to rights of nature. And we'll return to Birrarung.
G'day humans, it's producer Mark here. Just a quick little message to say that I am recording this as a voice memo on the More Than Human website. It's that easy. I'm on the couch on the weekend, quickly doing an edit of the show. Not that I need to do much. Tim has put this together remarkably, and I am overwhelmed by this episode. And I know that Tim and I both would love to hear how this is affecting you as well. Your stories about interacting with the Birrarung, with the natural world, and how the show is resonating with you. We'd love to hear from you, and of course, a rating or review on the show would help us a lot. Small independent shows like More Than Human grow by word of mouth, and leaving a rating or review is the quickest and easiest way for you to help us spread the word about the show. We've already received some great ones, and in coming episodes I look forward to sharing some of those with you that we've received. But for now, back to the show.
Hey humans, welcome back to Living with Birrarung and to our episode looking at the global rights of nature movement. Before the break, we looked at some of the key inflection points for this movement, and a handful of the diverse ways in which rights of nature are being applied to local context. I want to look closer at some of those diverse approaches, and ask, are some of them more or less successful than others? I asked Erin this question, and she began by explaining the difference between some of the terms we've been throwing around.
Yeah, so the global conversation around rights of nature is very much geared to legal rights and legal standing. So legal standing is the ability to go to court to defend your rights in law. And legal person is a way of acknowledging that a particular entity has the ability to bear rights and duties in law. So it can go to court to defend itself, it can hold specific rights, it can hold property, it can enter into and enforce contracts. It's got certain abilities in law to conduct itself as a decision-making entity, as a rights-bearing entity. So other people need to respect its rights. That can be a very powerful legal tool if you want to get into court. So if you need to go to court to defend the interests of the river, and the US is a place perhaps where that would be incredibly important, to use the court system to defend those rights of the river. In a place like Australia, where we are less litigious as a society, and it perhaps is more about convincing governments and government agencies to actually uphold their legal commitments, to be accountable to them, court is not necessarily the right place for that. And we've seen, particularly in the climate justice space, for instance, real struggles to get governments to recognise that they do owe a duty of care to their citizens. So maybe court is not where we need to go.
This is the benefit of having local community lead the way, as they are more likely to understand the local context and the potential pitfalls of trying the wrong approach for that context. So, in the case of Birrarung, we have a river that is recognised as a living entity, but not as a legal person. How is living entity different? Does it really have a place in our conversation about rights of nature if it isn't creating those legally defensible rights?
Its weakness is that it doesn't create those rights, it doesn't create legal personhood, it doesn't create legal standing. But it says the river is alive. And so what relationship do you want to have with this living entity if this living river does so much for you already? And Birrarung supplies 70% of Melbourne's drinking water. So we are all alive here because of Birrarung. What should we be doing in return for the river, for this living being that is making our lives possible? So living entity focuses on relationships. And it's invitational. It asks people to step into those relationships, to think about what a good relationship looks like. How do they create one? How do they recognise this living river as a being with whom they are in a relationship, rather than worrying about how the river is going to weaponise its rights against them, which is where legal personhood can very quickly take you.
I understand Erin's point about us not being as litigious as the US, and I'm drawn into her argument about building relationships. But if I'm honest, and this probably says more about me, I'm also a little cynical about how well that will play out in practice. Decision makers in private and public spheres don't always act in accordance with their own publicly professed values. How effective is this approach at holding them accountable? How effective is it for those who aren't already part of the choir, for those who aren't open to the invitation, or don't receive it? I raised this with Elke and Michelle when I spoke with each of them.
So granting living entity status to a forest or a river or a mountain or whatever, what it can achieve very much depends on how we frame it. So I feel like I'm sounding like a lawyer here by saying, well, it depends. But it does depend on how it's framed. So it can be anything. We've got this huge spectrum, and it's anything from purely symbolic, warm, fuzzy feelings, let's call it a living entity, but it has no protections or anything else, through to kind of significant protections, through to transformative relationship with nature, right? You've got the whole huge spectrum there. It's got the scope to change our extractive relationship to nature and change the way we manage pollution or development or all kinds of things. So the scope is there for it to be enormous. It's really up to us about how we write it into our laws on what effect it will have.
The Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, which was born in 2010, it's got a number of universal declarations for the rights of nature and a number of different ways of framing up that language. Within that context, what does a law that says something is a living entity mean? It's still a huge step, because it is, as I say, you're putting the lens of the law on, and suddenly the law is saying, oh, that river's alive, it's a living being. What does that mean? Well, I personally think it's up to the tool or the mechanism that created it and the communities themselves to determine what that means and how does that change their behaviour, if at all. But today what we see around the world, and we're seeing in the UK, it was very quiet over there for a long time, but we're seeing this burst in the last year of lots of charters for rivers in the United Kingdom. Most of them don't have legal standing yet, but the communities are saying, we want to recognise our rivers as alive. We want them to have legal rights. So it's the branches are growing in lots of different ways.
So living entity could be a step towards something greater. We saw in episode 2, Erin suggested that this could include changes to the Water Act in Victoria, and also pointed to the influence it has had on the development of the Water is Life framework for Aboriginal water rights. Uncle Andrew Gardner also mentioned the precedent it created on the journey towards treaty with First Peoples in Victoria. Transformative change can take time. Our governance and legal systems are, most of the time, iterative and incremental, and not immediate. That can be frustrating, but it also allows us to experiment and improve with each iteration. If there is enough momentum for change, it can be an opportunity.
In Australia, we have much more individualist legal system. We don't have that concept of the common good in the environment for all people, which is unfortunate. And I also think we've seen recently how hard it is to change the Constitution. So we're not going to see either of those methods give rise to this change in law. It's going to be incremental changes carried along with a little bit of cultural change and then more incremental changes, unfortunately. So it could take us a while, but it means we get to shape it how we like, and it might be a bit piecemeal for starters, but it means we can bring those changes in different states and federally if there was the appetite for it, but it might mean that it's a bit patchy to start with. I think when you're talking about law reform, the scope is really wide because you can actually make it whatever you want. That said, obviously there has to be the political appetite, and that might be an area that's going to take us a while in Australia. The scope is definitely there, and there's some fabulously creative lawyering going on to bring out those ideas and make sure they accurately reflect the First Nations values that they're trying to draw from, or that they give voice to the right guardian and so on. But it'd probably take us a while of experimenting, I think, to get where we want to go.
Before we explore what success could look like in that context, I want to introduce one other challenge that Michelle highlighted when we spoke.
What if we end up with a handful of rivers being recognised as living entities, but other rivers not being recognised as living entities? Where does it leave us? Does that mean that some rivers are more important than other rivers? Does it mean that some entities it's okay to use them as a drain, but something else is sacred?
When Michelle said this, I couldn't help but think that this may be just another manifestation of a very Western worldview. A projection of that individualism and exceptionalism that we apply to ourselves onto the natural entities we care most about. This series is focusing on Birrarung. But does flowing through Melbourne really make it more valuable than other rivers in the state? I was glad Michelle continued and offered another way to approach this.
The greatest inspiration for my vision for a future is actually the ancient practices of the past. If you look across how Aboriginal people governed their individual estates, their nations, pre-colonisation, and the work that I do with Indigenous elders like Mary Graham and others has taught me a huge amount about the governance approach. All of nature was sacralised. Every community looked after all of their estate. They didn't pick and choose which places were more important. There were certainly sacred sites, but everything was important. Their entire governance system was created and built through ancient learnings, through dreaming stories, through LORE and LAW, to ensure that life continued to regenerate itself, to ensure that life thrived everywhere. And to me, that is actually absolutely at the nub or the heart of what we should be doing in our society. Not arguing about which river should have rights, but actually using some of these concepts to spearhead a broader conversation about how we place caring for country at the centre of our governance. Because through bioregionalism or bioregioning, which is a trendy Western word for what many Indigenous cultures did for millennia, bioregioning means that all places are important, all ecosystems are important, and we have to find the right balance between human activities within the central priority of a thriving ecosystem.
This is something all of the approaches to rights of nature share, including living entity, an attempt to radically rethink our relationship with nature and shift our culture towards a more relational centre. So if that's the overarching goal, what does success actually look like?
Well, to me personally, success would actually look like Indigenous people being the leaders of a discussion about what a law already is for that place. And this is why the Birrarung has been so inspiring, because that's exactly what they've done. Listening to Indigenous peoples, understanding what the laws of the land are and what they were before colonisation, and then ideally having Indigenous and non-Indigenous people work together to construct the kind of words that not only breathe life into the law, but respect the unique qualities of those living entities. So we don't really want just a standard law pushed into the Western construct saying all rivers have rights. Because suddenly, what does that look like? Who implements it? How do you make any difference?
This might sound contradictory to what Michelle was saying earlier about sacralising all of nature, but I think it's actually an acknowledgement of one of the core frictions between an ambition to radically transform our culture and the current Western legal system we are operating within. Again, to emphasise a theme that keeps returning, Michelle went on to suggest that defining and achieving success ultimately comes back to local communities and community leadership.
I have to admit my bias. I work in a way that connects communities to an understanding of how the Australian legal system works, and it is colonial, Western predominantly, and top-down. So what do? We have a state law that says all rivers have rights. What does that mean? Who can speak for the river? Does that mean it's all government? Because it's those problems that we face today, a lack of resources, a lack of government will, a lack of government investment in compliance and care. What I'm interested in, what I think is success, is when you have legal change that reflects the cultural demand for ecological stewardship. And in a lot of communities that I work with around Australia, that's the most powerful force for good, is that lots of local people are already doing citizen science, measuring water quality, citizen movements, local groups trying to care for country, care for the rivers, understand First Nations, let First Nations leadership control and shape. But what they bump into is this ceiling of law. Local councils can't change the law for their local river. That belongs very much in the realm of the state government. So success in the rights of nature movement, I think, number one, has to involve greater protection for the living world, and that's a change in human behaviour. Number two, absolutely has to reflect the cultural and socio-political realities of that place. So what we don't want to do is continue being colonial and say one size fits all, and say, here's a law, pop it into your system and everything will be better. Because in reality, that may work if you've got well-funded government support, But I think one of the coolest things about rights of nature, generally speaking, is that it is a return to the idea that ordinary people care about their local places and should have a right to ecological stewardship.
I am increasingly convinced that in a world where we are encouraged to isolate ourselves on our islands of opinion and elevate the individual, community is medicine. And perhaps community centered around place, in relationship with place, is an antidote to the paralysis and cynicism and hopelessness. We are going to spend our next episode looking more closely at some of the organisations and people bringing communities together around Birrarung. For now, I want to give the final words to Elke to round out this exploration of rights of nature.
So all the piecemeal ways that we're bringing about rights of nature laws at the moment, internationally, I would think that they are not the end point. They are stepping stones on a path to where the rights of nature is just embedded in our whole legal system. So that would be my ideal, that we're looking more at sort of bringing in these things that seem really, really radical. So I heard recently that Tonga is planning to give Wales legal personhood. So it seems really radical, right? But in the long run, it would be lovely if we were at a point where we could look back, or where we just accepted that of course they're all got rights, and of course they're going to be part of our law making and decision making and so on, and governance. As environmental lawyers, we talk about law reform all the time, and sometimes it is so dry and boring and no one wants to listen to us. But when we talk about rights of nature, people get really excited and people respond. And I think that's because it speaks to a sense of hope or excitement that we might actually be able to upend this system, this industrial capitalist system that we have at the moment, that doesn't value the environment in the way it should and doesn't recognise interconnection or interdependence between species. It has got no sort of concept of multi-species justice. So when people think about the rights of nature, often it's just sparking something really exciting and good. So I think we will keep seeing that happening, but we will be needing to adapt a lot as we go and think really flexibly about whether the legal vehicle we're choosing is the right one to express the rights we want in the way we want and for the specific place. Obviously, it's got to arise from, that culture in that place that relates to that river and so on. So there's a lot of work ahead for the movement, I think.
In this episode, you heard the voices of Dr. Erin O'Donnell from the Melbourne Law School and Birrarung Council, Elke Nicholson from Environmental Justice Australia, and Michelle Maloney from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. You can find out more about our guests and the information discussed in this episode in our show notes, or head to morethanhumanpod.net and click Dive Deeper. More Than Human is an independent production from me, Tim McIntosh Hanna, and Mark Spencer from Here Media. This is our third episode in our series about Birrarung, and we have several more planned as we explore some of the specific projects putting the ideas we've discussed in our first 3 episodes into practice. If you would like to support our work, please leave us a review and rate the show wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help us reach new people. And share this series with your friends, family, and colleagues. And another shout out, you can leave us a voicemail by clicking the little blue microphone on our website, morethanhumanpod.net. We'd love to hear how you're connecting with your local waterways, and who knows, we might even have an opportunity to share some of these stories on the show. We'll be back next month with episode 4, Coherence.